For 3,000 years, Ethiopia was ruled under a monarchy, with emperors as the hereditary rulers until its abolition in 1975. The emperors traced their origins back to biblical times. It was widely believed that they descended directly from the marriage of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In 1974, Ethiopia entered a period of profound political, economic, and social change, frequently accompanied by violence. A period that historians would refer to as the Ethiopian Revolution. The confrontation between traditional and modern forces erupted and changed the entire nature of the Ethiopian state forever. In this 4-part series, AFRISTORY will take you through the history of the Ethiopian Revolution. Part 1. On the 2nd of November 1930, Ras Tafari Makonnen was crowned as the Emperor of Ethiopia. During his coronation, he changed his name to Emperor Haile Selassie, which meant power to the Trinity. It was here that his rule officially began, ruling Ethiopia a record of 44 years until his overthrow in 1974. Throughout his rule, Selassie attempted to modernize the country through a series of political and social reforms, including the introduction of Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931 and the abolition of slavery. In 1930, Italy under Benito Mussolini invaded and occupied Ethiopia. The emperor was toppled and later left for exile in England. However, when Italy joined the Second World War on the side of Hitler, Britain declared war on Mussolini and his colonial possessions. And so, in 1940, Italy was defeated in the East African Campaign and the emperor was reinstated as the ruler of Ethiopia by the British. On return, Selassie dissolved the Federation of Eritrea and Ethiopia, which had been established by the UN General Assembly. He then integrated Eritrea as a province of Ethiopia, among other reasons to have access to the Red Sea, a move that was backed by the US, who also wanted a secure base in Massawa and Asmara. However, this move would later be among his undoing for him as well as his successors. During the 1960s, the emperor faced strong resistance on several fronts. An Oromo uprising erupted in the Bale province in southern Ethiopia, lasting for 7 years. Somali insurgents in Ogaden formed the West Somali Liberation Front, aiming to drive out the Ethiopians and create an independent state. In Eritrea, the Eritrean Liberation Front launched a war of independence against Ethiopia that eventually required an entire division of Haile Selassie's troops to contain. The situation couldn't have been worse for the emperor, when an increasingly radical student movement in Addis Ababa, the capital, labeled him as an American puppet and his feudal landlords as the enemy of the people. Under the motto, "Land to the tiller," the students sought to limit property size and rights. In retaliation, the emperor suppressed all revolts through brutal methods, leaving no room for dissent. A special treatment was given to Eritrea and Ogaden, where burning and bombing of villages took place indiscriminately, leading to civilian casualties. As a result, the monarchy gradually lost its credibility in these regions and back home. To tighten his grip on power, the emperor employed feudal landlords, the church, and the military to maintain his rule. Now, this is how it worked. The feudal landlords managed the provincial administration and taught people to obey the commands of their rulers. The church attributed divine powers to the emperor, and the whole socio-economic structure was maintained through the army, which controlled the country with ruthlessness. For centuries, the monarchy relied on a feudal mode of production, which had been the major element of the Ethiopian economy, with land being the most important means of production. However, land had been grabbed by the church, owning 25%, the emperor and his family 20%, the feudal landlords 30%, and the state 18%, leaving a mere 7% to the 23 million odd Ethiopian peasants. In addition, the landless peasants surrendered as much as 75% of their produce to the feudal landlords as a form of tax. By 1974, the Ethiopians had reached a breaking point when the emperor became notorious for his attempts to conceal the existence of the Wall of Famine that had hit the Wolo province in 1973. The concealment was so widespread that it became to be known as the Hidden Famine. 200,000 men, 650,000 cattle, 525,000 sheep, 450,000 goats, and 50,000 camels all perished without the world ever knowing about them. Reports of the famine were consistently ignored or denied by the emperor. In response to a report by UNICEF documenting famine conditions in July 1973, the Vice Minister of Planning stated, "If we have to describe the situation in the way you have in order to generate international assistance, then we don't need that assistance. The embarrassment to the government isn't worth it." When Haile Selassie later paid a visit to the area, he merely referred to natural disasters beyond human control that had often afflicted Ethiopia, and implied that little could be done to prevent them. The imperial government intentionally turned a deaf ear to the sufferings of the people, while autocratic rulers continued to live in luxury and even exported grain. The famine created a problem that the emperor didn't see coming. Thousands of the famine-stricken fled to the cities, increasing the number of unemployed, frustrated, and creating potential rebels. The prices of all essential commodities increased and dissatisfaction spread evenly amongst the armed forces, who now even demanded higher wages and salaries. The Wolo famine gained political capital among students, army, and the middle classes of Addis Ababa, supplementing 8 decades of political marginalization as well as economic stagnation. For the first time in the history of Ethiopia, the people in the capital Addis Ababa staged a massive protest against the government in February 1974. It started with the royal family-owned bus service known as the Ambessa bus drivers, which was the only bus service in the capital. The drivers walked out to paralyze commuting and public transportation, demanding higher wages and pay. On the same day, taxi drivers went on strike, demanding lower gas prices. Students and teachers swarmed the city streets protesting the new policy of education. Student demonstrations continued in major cities where they destroyed buildings and commercial centers. What was surprising was that the army and the police were not arresting any of the protesters. In any case, they gave them protection and advised them not to damage the property. On the side of the military, something was simultaneously brewing within this period. The first major mutiny occurred on the 12th of January 1974 at an army outpost in Nehere, southern Ethiopia, over poor living conditions. The soldiers demanded proper uniforms, food, and water in the base from their commanders in the capital, who ignored them. Then they tried their luck with the commander of the ground force, General Deris Dubale, whom they asked to come and see the situation for himself. When the commander and his staff went to Nehere, the soldiers detained the commander and his men, offered them the bad food and water for nourishment. They then asked for a more senior official to come and address their issues. Having caught the attention of their seniors with the arrests, the army mediators obliged and sent General Abela Abebe, who agreed to meet their demands if they freed the detained general. However, upon returning to Addis Ababa, General Abebe ordered the arrest of the leaders of the mutiny. Those who had not been arrested threatened that if the detained men in Nehere were not released right away, they would stage another mutiny. So, the arrested soldiers were later released, but the word of the Nehere mutiny had already spread through the army's network to every unit in the country like wildfire. On release, General Dubare's troubles did not end in Nehere. He was sent to Dolo, a town on the Ethiopia-Kenyan border, where a battalion of the 24th Brigade was in mutiny. While there, he was made to sit under the scorching sun for half a day. When he got thirsty and hungry, they treated him to dirty water and bread full of grit. A month later, airmen at Bishofu Air Force Base staged another revolt and sit-down strike. They distributed leaflets with a list of demands in all Air Force bases, including Asmara, Diadawa, and most of the Army and Naval bases. The demands included a triple rise in salaries, free medication, among others. When they refused the orders to go back to work, the government sent in a police commando unit to surround the entire Air Force base, but the organizers persuaded the police not to attack the base because their victory would be helpful to them too. On learning about this, the defense minister then sent the chief of staff, General Asefa Ayene, who had been the commander of the Air Force a few years back. Knowing that the man was dangerous and would not hesitate to crush the mutineers returned to work with no results. Defeated, the leaders of the mutiny did not stop the struggle. They left the base to the awakened people, including police officers, students, army, and other workers. On the 23rd of February, the emperor stepped in. While addressing his beloved people, as he would refer to them on radio and TV, Haile Selassie offered concessions. He postponed changes in the education system, reduced fuel price increases, and implemented price controls to check inflation. He also dismissed his prime minister, Aklelo Habtewald, and agreed to revise the constitution to make the prime minister answerable to a parliament, a change that in Ethiopian terms would amount to a major reform. However, on the 25th of February, a more serious revolt broke out in Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, led by a group of sergeants and corporals. The mutineers took control of a radio station and broadcasted demands of more pay and improved conditions of service. They also demanded the removal of the emperor's grandson, Admiral Alexander Desta, as the commander of the army and other commanders they hated. During his address on the 27th of February to the representatives of the armed forces, the emperor appealed to their nationalism and pleaded with them not to ask for more than the country could afford, and to also protect the country. He also made a raise of $15 right away and appointed Oxford-educated Untitled Makonnen as the new prime minister. Satisfied with what they had achieved, the mutineers went to the king, thanked him for the pay rises, expressed their loyalty to the crown, handed over the members of the old cabinet whom they had detained, and retired to their barracks, marking the end of the first round of the uprising. However, the civilian resistance continued from where the soldiers had left off. The radical elements within the civilian population accused the army of being interested only in pay increases for its members and betraying the people's movement by going back to their barracks. They also urged that what was needed was not a reshuffle of the cabinet, but a more fundamental change. They distributed clandestine leaflets vilifying members of the new cabinet, especially the new Prime Minister Ndalkaku, by way of showing that the new cabinet was, if anything, worse than the old. In March, more strikes and demonstrations burst out in towns and cities of Ethiopia. One group after another, civil servants, teachers, students, journalists, priests, and even prostitutes took to the streets. They held a massive demonstration in protest against the official discrimination against Islam and calling for the separation of church and state and equal status for their religion. The most persistent demand was for the arrest and trial of former ministers and parish officials on charges of negligence and corruption. In order not to let a good opportunity go to waste, inmates of Addis Ababa prison went on a rampage for 4 days, resulting in shootouts and deaths among prisoners and guards. The chaos came to an end when the government established a committee to look into the grievances of the inmates. The Confederation of Ethiopian Labor Unions, CELU, brought the country to its knees, a general strike of its 85,000 members. A deepening crisis was averted within 4 days, with CELU concluding a 17-point agreement with the central government in which the rights demanded were granted. On the 11th of March, 1,800 employees of the Civil Aviation Agency petitioned the government to grant them the right to form trade union, free medical services, the right to have their insurance paid for by the state, free education, which would enable them to improve their professional skills, among other demands. So, they went on strike the same day. As a result, flights were disrupted for completely 3 days and partially thereafter. At this point, the most obvious question was if the army was going to come on the side of the government, and uphold law and order, or whether it was going to support the resistance to the government. Well, within the armed forces, a group of officers conspired to take control. They met at the 4th Division headquarters in Addis Ababa at the end of June and formed a military committee which they named the DAG, literally meaning committee. The DAG wanted to maintain law and order, which seemingly looked that they would be on the side of the emperor or the government. The committee was composed of 110 representatives chosen by units of the armed forces to run the country. For many months, the DAG remained a shadowy organization. None of the names of its members were announced and also kept its activities secret from the public. Major Mengistu Haile Mariam was elected as its chairman, Major Atanafo Abete, the vice chairman, and Major Gabriel Weldi Hana, the secretary general of the DAG. On the 4th of July, the DAG issued a statement pledging loyalty to the emperor, giving its major goals as upholding of the crown and the smooth functioning of the civilian government. With this, the emperor gave in on key concessions that included power to arrest not only military officers but government officials at every level. The DAG kicked off its arrests with former prime ministers Aklil Habtawald and Untitled Makonnen, who had only served for 4 months, along with most of their cabinets, regional governors, and many senior military officials and officials of the imperial court were imprisoned. Moving slow but sure, the DAG systematically dismantled the entire imperial structure and numerous public institutions. In July and August, long lists of names of Paris servants, top government officials, and prominent aristocrats, including Haile Selassie's closest advisors, were called on to give themselves up or face confiscation of their assets. Most surrendered voluntarily, while some were arrested by force. Hundreds were jailed in basements of buildings in the Grand Paris, packed so tight they had to take turns lying down on bare earthen floor for sleep. At the Jubilee Palace, the emperor's residence, he was only left with a handful of personal servants. Isolated, the DAG then turned to the emperor himself. They accused him of squandering the country's meager resources on expensive trips abroad and of being negligent to the wall of famine. At a 4-day secret meeting in early September, the DAG voted to dethrone Haile Selassie. On the 11th of September, 9 princesses, including the emperor's sole surviving daughter and 7 granddaughters, were imprisoned in a dungeon-like cell, their heads shaved, allowing only 2 mattresses to share between them. On the same day, officers from the DAG interrogated Haile Selassie on the whereabouts of his fortune. As one officer asked, "But surely, Your Majesty, you must have put something aside for your retirement." The emperor replied, "For an emperor, there is no retirement. Having not provided for our retirement, we have nothing." The officers then asked the emperor to watch a British television documentary called The Hidden Famine with them. The documentary was aired on national TV as an expose examining how thousands of men, women, and children had been allowed to starve in Wollo the previous year. The film was split with scenes showing the emperor and his entourage drinking champagne and feeding meat to his dogs from a silver tray on one side, while people in Wollo starved on the other. According to eyewitnesses, seated in an armchair, Haile Selassie watched the film to the end and became lost in thought. The following morning, on the 12th of September, 3 officers from the DAG, dressed in combat uniforms, entered the chamber where Haile Selassie awaited them. They read out a proclamation of deposition dethroning the emperor. The emperor listened calmly, then replied that if the revolution was good for the people, then I too support it. "In that case, Your Majesty, will you please follow us?" said the major. "Where to?" asked the emperor. "To a safe place His Majesty will see," replied the major. Haile Selassie, who was accustomed to Rolls Royces, was placed into a tiny Volkswagen and drove through the empty streets of Addis Ababa to the 4th Division barracks. The emperor spent the last months of his life imprisoned in rooms in the Grand Paris, Within the hour, Radio Addis Ababa reported the DAG had freed Ethiopia from Haile Selassie's oppression. Haile Selassie died a prisoner on the 27th of August 1975. The DAG announced his death on a radiocast and said he had been found dead in his bed by a servant, and that the cause of death was probably related to the effects of a prostate operation that he underwent 2 months earlier. The official sources announced that the burial of the former emperor was to be in the strictest privacy and had to take place within 24 hours after death as per the Ethiopian custom. No one knew where the emperor was buried except the people that buried him. Another version of his death indicated that he had been in good health, and the 83-year-old had been suffocated to death with a wet pillow. His body was buried beneath a lavatory in the palace, remaining hidden there for 16 years while the revolution revved on. In 1992, his remains were exhumed and reburied in Bata Church near the tomb of his great-uncle, Emperor Menelik II, after a befitting imperial funeral by Ethiopian Orthodox Church on the 5th of November 2000. With the overthrow and eventual death of the emperor, the DAG's power increased, became law unto itself, and ruled Ethiopia by decree. The power struggles within itself led to the murder of its own members, leading to the rise of Haile Mariam Mengistu, ushering in a dictatorial regime that tormented and unleashed terror on the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea.